For years, a strange and oddly persistent theory has floated around the internet. Was SpongeBob SquarePants adopted? And the first time you hear it, it sounds crazy absurd. Like one of those creepy fan theories cooked up at 3 a.m. by someone who's clearly spent way too much time thinking about SpongeBob. Like me, for example. But then you look at his parents, and the confusion starts to make sense. Harold and Margaret SquarePants look nothing like him. They're brown, round, and, well, not very square. So I kinda get why people start raising questions. But unlike Mr. Krabs' family, where half the members are some urban legend, SpongeBob's relatives actually show up on the show. A lot of them, too. We've seen his grandparents, his cousins, even his great-great ancestors. So what's the big clue that makes fans keep insisting that there's something wrong with SpongeBob's family when the show has already given us the answers? I just can't get this curiosity out of my head. So I'm going to trace this theory from every clue we could find and try to figure out what this adoption mystery actually says about SpongeBob, and maybe even about us. Because if there's one thing I've learned from this channel, it's that the strangest questions often hide the most human truths. Every mystery starts with something small, a tiny detail that's often overlooked. And for SpongeBob's adoption theory, that detail is his parents. Old, brown, round little sea sponges living in a coral home, wearing matching outfits, and sounding like every sweet elderly couple you've ever met. They're also kind, supportive, and unmistakably cookie-shaped. Now, put them next to SpongeBob and suddenly things don't quite line up. He's yellow, he's square, well, he looks more like a kitchen sponge. Now it's like looking at a bright piece of cheese standing next to 2 gingerbread cookies. Originally, that's the first big red flag that made fans say, they don't look alike, so maybe he's not theirs? I just realized that argument is something you'd expect from the Krabby Chronicle. Something like a big news headline like, local sponge not related to cookie parents. It's funny to think about. I don't know why. Jokes aside, their visual differences definitely look strange on paper. Even as a kid, I remember thinking SpongeBob's parents were just old chocolate cookies who got onto the wrong show. But things actually start to make sense when you pull back and look at the bigger picture, SpongeBob's entire family tree. Because as it turns out, SpongeBob's grandparents are 2 different kinds of sponges. On his father's side, there's Grandma SquarePants, the warm, brown, round sponge who loves to spoil SpongeBob. You've definitely seen her, always offering him cookies, tea, and hugs every now and then. But then there's her late husband, Grandpa SquarePants.
If we were meant to fly, hey, I'm not your grandfather.
A bright yellow, square-shaped sponge. Basically the same look as SpongeBob, just older. So right away, we already see 2 completely different sponge types under the same roof. Now, there's also another funny thing I used to believe. Maybe Harold and Margaret are just old kitchen sponges that got left underwater too long? You know how the bright yellow sponge you use at home turns brown and floppy after a few weeks? Yeah, that was my childhood logic. But then you remember Grandpa SquarePants existed, and he's also old, yet still perfectly yellow and square. Which means no, this isn't about aging. There are just 2 different species of sea sponge in this universe, brown and round, yellow and square. And they all exist within the same family. It's just diversity. Even Harold's sibling is a perfect example of this. One brother named Sherm SquarePants, a yellow square sponge capable of shoving an entire watermelon up his nose. Sherm also has a son, Stanley SquarePants, who is basically SpongeBob's taller, identical twin, except slightly less competent. And then there's another brother, Captain Blue, the hearing-impaired SquarePants, father of cousin Blackjack from the episode Blackjack in Season 5. Both of them are brown and round like Harold and Margaret. And that's just within SpongeBob's direct relatives. If you zoom out to his ancestors, there's SpongeBuck from the Wild West, or Sponge Gar from prehistoric Bikini Bottom. They all look exactly like SpongeBob. So if SpongeBob's shape and color are supposedly what make him different, that difference clearly runs in the family. So, case closed, right? Well, no, obviously not, because if there's one rule with fan theories, it's this. When logic doesn't work, the imagination goes wild. And that's exactly what happens next. When people realize the cookie parents argument doesn't hold up, the theory starts evolving in scale, and not in a way you would expect. You see, one of the biggest smoking guns that completely debunked this whole adoption theory came from one scene, one clip, one tiny weird flashback about SpongeBob in his mother's womb. You know the one from Truth or Square. It shows baby SpongeBob floating peacefully inside his mom's womb, happily eating a Krabby Patty before he's even born. At first, it looks adorable, but then your brain catches up. Wait a minute, sponges don't have wombs. And suddenly, that cute scene becomes one of the most confusing clues. Real sponges don't give birth like mammals. They reproduce by releasing larvae into the water that attach to coral or rocks. Some species do it by budding. So this scene, it's completely impossible in nature. Even if we did pretend the SquarePants family somehow worked like mammals, it still wouldn't make sense for him to remember a day before he was even born, let alone his first fast food meal. In fact, that impossibility might actually be the point of the scene. It's part of a storytelling montage. SpongeBob reminiscing about his past, jumping through exaggerated cartoonish memories. It's more of a sentimental and imaginative segment. He's imagining what it might have been like. Which, if you know SpongeBob, makes perfect sense. This is the guy who once turned a cardboard box into a space simulator just by pretending hard enough.
Imagination.
He's built entire worlds out of thin air, or technically thin water. So of course, he'd imagine his own birth with perfect lighting and a Krabby Patty. But even here, some people still try to push it further. If it's imagination, then maybe his memories were implanted. Maybe he's some kind of clone. And at that point, you just have to stop and breathe. If anything, the womb scene doesn't disprove his connection to his parents, it makes the adoption theory even more absurd. What, are we gonna say SpongeBob's imagination is so powerful he literally rewrites his own origin story just to make it more emotional? So we set that aside and let the theory escalate again. Since the family tree checks out and the womb scene doesn't break it, people start reaching further. Not only that, they also managed to tie it in with another existing theory. One of the oldest and still most popular is the idea that SpongeBob isn't a sea sponge at all. Instead, he's a kitchen sponge, a man-made cleaning product that somehow fell off a ship, sank to the ocean floor, and came to life. In other words, the ocean's first living piece of pollution, a walking, talking, square-shaped miracle of human trash. And to be fair, that does sound almost believable in SpongeBob logic. The show itself loves to make jokes about it. This is a world where a crab runs a fast food restaurant, a squirrel lives underwater in a dome, so a kitchen sponge coming to life? Sure, why not? So by that reasoning, do Harold and Margaret just adopt SpongeBob out of pity? They can't just leave a stranded kitchen sponge, so they take it home? But even that theory collapses the second you remember the show actually proves SpongeBob is a real sea sponge over and over again. He could regenerate his body. He could split into clones. He can even separate his limbs and have them function independently. SpongeBob is a pure sea periphera, all right. Real sponges, the kind that live on coral reefs, can do that too. They don't have brains or organs or blood. They're basically colonies of cells that rebuild themselves constantly. Cut one in half and you don't kill it, you just make two sponges. It's like living Play-Doh. But of course some don't stop there. The theories get way more absurd. Because if we see SpongeBob's powers, his speed, his durability, the way he survives explosions, it's not normal at all. Then maybe he's a mutation. Maybe he's the result of radiation, one of the many victims of Bikini Atoll. But you've probably heard this one. The idea that Bikini Bottom sits directly below the real-world nuclear test site, and that all the talking sea creatures are the result of leftover radiation from those bombs. Until you remember, everyone in this show can survive explosions. Even a single-celled plankton can survive multiple explosions throughout the show. That's just Bikini Bottom physics. And so if Bikini Atoll is tied to this theory, it would just make all of them mutants, right? Either way, SpongeBob isn't special. If anything, this only proves how normal he actually is compared to everyone else. And still, that doesn't stop people from trying to explain the unexplainable. Because when science starts breaking apart, someone always tries to fix it with more science. So they bring out the big guns, genetics. Yeah, I'm not kidding. Because, sure, we've seen that SpongeBob's family has both brown round and yellow square sponges. But the catch is that every parent is matched with their kids. Uncle Sherm and Stanley, square and yellow. Uncle Blue and Blackjack, round and brown. Then people ask, both Harold and Margaret are brown round types of sponges. How did two circles make a square? That's just impossible. And I mean, fair question. You don't usually see geometry get that aggressive in genetics. But remember those Punnett squares you probably doodled on your biology homework? That's where this fits in. Imagine Harold and Margaret each have two traits, color and shape. Brown and round are the dominant ones, yellow and square are recessive. And if both parents quietly carry those recessive genes hidden behind their cookie-colored exterior, there's a 1 in 16 chance their kid ends up square and yellow. Statistically rare, yes, but still possible. So after all that talk about nuclear fallout and sentient kitchen sponges, it turns out the real answer might just be a Punnett square. Which, if you think about it, is kind of hilarious. The mystery fans have been chasing for years can literally be solved by the same worksheet you used to figure out why your eyes are blue. In fact, SpongeBob shares the exact same eye features as Margaret. So no, two random circles don't make squares, but two round sponges carrying the right traits could absolutely make a square one. Ironically, after 4 wild detours, the cookie parents, the imaginary womb, the pollution theory, even Bikini Atoll, every clue we found points to the same boring conclusion. Nothing's wrong, everything's normal. Which leaves us with one final question to answer. If there's no secret and no conspiracy, then why does this theory exist at all? Maybe the reason this theory exists in the first place isn't because SpongeBob is shaped differently from his parents, but because his behavior is completely different from his parents. Like I said before, Harold and Margaret are a polite and sweet elderly couple, and so their son is basically a lunatic compared to them. This has also been a running theme with the show. We asked why Eugene Krabs has a whale for a daughter. That made Pearl's theory I covered some time ago. Why is Squidward the grumpy one while his parents are a complete joker and a badass? Also a topic I've talked about. We're just so used to asking these kinds of questions. Layer that with the fact we also live in a time where every story feels like it needs a tragic backstory. Every hero has trauma, every cartoon needs a dark twist, and every smile is treated like it's hiding something. So when we see a character who is genuinely content, who loves his parents, his job, and his life, we assume it has to be fake. There must be something darker underneath. But truth be told, SpongeBob SquarePants isn't adopted. He isn't a clone or a lab experiment or a piece of radioactive dish sponge that fell from a ship. He's exactly what the show tells us he is, a happy, square little sea sponge with a loving family. That's it. No twist, no hidden tragedy waiting behind the pineapple door. And in its own quiet way, that's rarer than any secret adoption reveal could ever be. So in the end, SpongeBob's adoption theory doesn't hide any secret parents or lost origins. It never did. Instead, it's about us, about how we keep looking for sadness in places where it doesn't belong. SpongeBob's family isn't broken. He's not an experiment. He's just unapologetically content with his life. And in a world that thrives on chaos, irony, and cynicism, that kind of pure joy almost feels unnatural. But what if it really is unnatural? What if SpongeBob's unstoppable cheerfulness, the laughter, the optimism, the endless positivity isn't a family trait, but a defense mechanism? What if his happiness is the mask that keeps everyone else, and maybe even himself, from realizing there's something darker underneath? Because maybe the real mystery isn't whether SpongeBob was adopted, it's how far he's willing to go to keep the world smiling with him. But if you want to see how deep that rabbit hole, or, well, pineapple hole, really goes, there's one episode that quietly explains everything. Of course, you'll find it in my previous video, the episode that solves SpongeBob's paradox. I'll see you in the next dive.